She had been working since early morning, moving quietly through the large house, carrying trays and clearing glasses. Her name was Clara, and she was 23 years old, living in a small rented room on the edge of the city. She had learned long ago how to stay unnoticed, especially in places where wealth filled the air and voices carried confidence. She did not have this party was larger than any she had worked before, a grand birthday celebration for a powerful businessman known among the guests as a man who enjoyed control and attention. The mansion was bright with gold light chandeliers reflected on polished floors, and music floated softly from hidden speakers. The guests arrived in fine clothes, laughing loudly, speaking of deals and travels, while Clara and the other staff moved like shadows, trained to be efficient and invisible. Clara wore a simple white uniform, clean and pressed, her hair tied back neatly. She had been told to keep her eyes down and her voice low. She followed the rules without complaint because the pay mattered, and because she had learned that arguing never brought good results. As she served drinks, she noticed the grand piano placed near the center of the main hall, its black surface shining under the lights. It was a beautiful instrument, the kind she had only seen from a distance. Her chest tightened when she looked at it. Memories surfaced uninvited of evenings long ago when her mother would sit at a worn piano in their old apartment, playing softly while Clara listened from the doorway. Those nights felt far away now, like another life. She pushed the thought aside and continued working. The guests grew louder as the night went on, laughter mixed with music and the clinking of glasses. The host walked among them, confident and smiling, enjoying every glance in his direction. He was tall, well-dressed, and used to being obeyed. His eyes scanned the room, often landing on the staff, not with kindness, but with interest, as if they were pieces on a board. Clara felt his gaze once and quickly looked away. Her hands trembled slightly. As she steadied a tray, she told herself it was just nerves and focused on her task. She was assigned to the main hall near the piano, where guests gathered in groups, talking and watching the entertainment hired for the evening. A small band played lightly near the wall, but during a break the room fell into a restless quiet. People looked around, waiting for something new to happen. The host raised his glass and spoke loudly, drawing attention. He joked about boredom and surprise, and his eyes moved again toward the staff, this time stopping on Clara. She felt a sudden heat in her face as she realized he was looking directly at her. He asked her name and she answered softly, her voice barely carrying in the large room. Some guests smiled amused, others watched with curiosity. The host asked her where she was from and why she worked there. She answered briefly, aware of the many eyes on her. The conversation felt unbalanced, like a game she did not choose to play. Then his gaze shifted toward the piano, and a slow smile appeared. He asked her if she could play it. The question landed heavy in the air. Clara felt her heart race. She hesitated, knowing honesty could be dangerous, but lies could be worse. She said quietly that she could play a little, which was true, though it did not begin to explain the years of practice, the sacrifices, or the dreams she had buried. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some laughed softly, others leaned closer, sensing entertainment. The host clapped his hands and said that it would be fun to hear her play something simple. He spoke as if giving a gift, not issuing a command. Clara understood the power in his tone. Refusal was not truly an option. She glanced toward her supervisor, who gave a small, uncertain nod, as if to say, do what he wants. The room felt suddenly smaller, the lights brighter, and the piano closer than ever. As Clara walked toward the instrument, her steps felt heavy. She could hear whispers behind her, some kind, some mocking, some simply curious. She sat on the bench, smoothing her uniform, trying to steady her breathing. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and for a moment fear threatened to take over, fear of making a mistake, fear of confirming every low expectation placed on her by people who saw only her role and not her story. She closed her eyes briefly and thought of her mother, of the music that once filled their small home, and of the promise she made to herself to never forget who she was. She placed her hands on the keys and waited. The room grew quiet in a way that felt sharp and exposing. The host stood nearby, watching with a look that suggested amusement and challenge. Clara took a slow breath and prepared to play, not knowing that this moment would change how everyone in that room saw her, including herself. Clara let her fingers rest on the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath her skin. The room remained silent in a way that felt heavy and expectant. She could sense the eyes on her from every direction, some filled with doubt, some with amusement, some with open curiosity. The host stood a few steps away, arms crossed, waiting, as if watching a test he already believed she would fail. Clara straightened her back and reminded herself to breathe slowly. The piano was familiar, even in this unfamiliar place, and that comfort gave her a small sense of control. She began with a simple melody, choosing something gentle and steady to calm her nerves. The first notes floated through the hall, soft but clear at first. A few guests exchanged glances, as if surprised that she knew where to begin. The sound of conversation stopped completely. Chairs shifted as people turned their bodies toward the piano. Clara focused on the movement of her hands, letting memory guide her rather than fear. She had played this piece many times alone, late at night on an old keyboard with uneven keys, always imagining a better instrument, a better room, and a moment where she could be heard. As the melody continued, her confidence grew slightly. She allowed more feeling into the music, shaping each phrase with care. Her shoulders relaxed, and her breathing settled. The piano responded beautifully, its sound rich and full, filling the high-ceilinged room in a way that made the air feel alive. Some guests leaned forward, others stopped sipping their drinks. The host raised his eyebrows for the first time, his smile fading into something more serious, though he said nothing. Clara transitioned smoothly into a more complex passage. Her fingers moved faster now with practiced precision, The music carried emotion, warmth, and restraint at the same time. It told a quiet story of longing and strength without needing words. She was no longer thinking about the crowd or the reason she was there. She was thinking about the music and about how it deserved to be played. Honestly, her face softened, and her expression grew focused. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. In the crowd, reactions began to shift. A woman near the front lowered her glass slowly, her eyes fixed on Clara. A man whispered something to his companion and shook his head in disbelief. Another guest smiled openly, clearly moved by what they were hearing. Even those who had laughed earlier now stood still, listening. The band members at the side of the room watched with interest, recognizing skill. When they heard it, the atmosphere changed from playful expectation to respectful attention. The host took a step closer to the piano, studying Clara more carefully. Now he had expected embarrassment, perhaps a few wrong notes and nervous mistakes. Instead, he was hearing control, balance, and depth. His expression tightened, not with anger, but with confusion, as if a simple story he believed was becoming complicated in front of him. He glanced around and noticed that the attention he usually commanded had shifted entirely to the young woman in a plain uniform at the piano. Clara moved into the heart of the piece, allowing the music to rise in intensity. The notes grew fuller and more emotional, drawing the listeners deeper into the sound. Her fingers pressed the keys with confidence shaped by years of discipline. She remembered practicing in silence with headphones on so she would not disturb neighbors. She remembered choosing groceries carefully to save money for lessons. She remembered telling no one about her dream because it felt safer that way. All of that lived in the music, now giving it weight and truths. A quiet emotion spread through the room, not sadness, but something reflective and sincere. The guests felt it even if they could not explain why. The piano seemed to speak of effort and patience and dignity, the kind not bought or displayed, but earned slowly over time. Clara felt a strange calm wash over her, as if the music was carrying her forward and holding her steady at the same time. She no longer felt small or out of place. She felt present and capable. When she reached the final section, she slowed slightly, allowing each note to breathe. She wanted to honor the ending, not rush through it. The room was so quiet that the sound of the piano seemed amplified, every detail clear and bright. Her last notes lingered gently in the air before fading into silence. Her hands rested on the keys for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what she had just shared. No one spoke immediately. The silence that followed was different from before. It was full and heavy with feeling. Then one person began to clap slowly. The sound echoed, and another joined, then another, until the room filled with applause. Some guests stood, others smiled broadly. A few even wiped their eyes. The host remained still for a moment longer, watching Clara as if seeing her for the first time, not as staff, but as a person with depth he had not anticipated. Clara stood up from the bench, her legs slightly unsteady now that the music had ended. She turned to face the crowd, unsure how to respond to the applause, her face flushed with a mix of relief and emotion. She gave a small polite nod the way she had been taught, and stepped back from the piano, not yet knowing how this moment would change what came next, but feeling certain that something important had already shifted inside her. The applause continued longer than Clara expected, and it felt unreal, as if it belonged to another person standing where she was moments ago. She kept her hands folded in front of her and waited for it to stop, because she did not know what else to do. Her heart was beating fast, but there was a warmth in her chest that she had not felt in years. Some guests looked at her with open admiration, others with surprise, as if their own assumptions had been gently but firmly corrected. The host finally lifted his hand, and the clapping slowly faded. He smiled again, but it was a different smile, now less playful and more measured. He thanked her in front of everyone and said he did not expect that kind of performance. His words were polite, but his tone carried a hint of discomfort, as though the evening had taken a turn he had not planned. Clara nodded quietly and stepped back toward the edge of the room, ready to return to her duties, believing the moment was over. But the room had changed, and so had the way people looked at her. As she walked past the guests, several of them spoke to her softly, offering praise, asking where she learned to play, telling her she had real talent. Clara answered briefly, still unsure how to hold this new attention. It felt fragile, like something that could disappear if she touched it too directly. Her supervisor watched her closely now, with a mixture of pride and concern, uncertain how the rest of the night would unfold. The band members approached her during their break. One of them, an older pianist, spoke kindly and said her touch was controlled and expressive. The words meant more to her than the applause, because they came from someone who understood music. She thanked him and felt a quiet validation settle inside her, something she had long denied herself, the idea that her skill was real and not just a private comfort. The host observed all of this from a distance, speaking with his guests, yet keeping Clara within his sight. He was not angry, but he was unsettled. The power dynamic he enjoyed had shifted slightly, and he could feel it. Some guests now spoke of the performance more than of him, and that fact stayed with him. He eventually called Clara over again. This time his voice was calm and public. He asked about her background and her training in more detail. Clara answered honestly, but simply. She spoke of her mother, who taught her the basics, and of years spent practicing alone while working different jobs to survive. The room listened again, though the energy was different now, less expectant and more respectful. Some guests nodded, others seemed thoughtful, hearing how discipline and hardship had shaped her ability. The story challenged their quiet beliefs about talent and class without accusing anyone directly. As the night continued, Clara returned to serving, but the weight of the tray felt lighter, and her steps more confident. She noticed small changes. Guests thanked her by name, asked for her opinion, smiled more easily. The mansion felt less hostile and more human, though she knew this feeling might not last beyond the night. She focused on staying present and doing her job well. Inside her, something steady had formed, not pride exactly, but certainty. She understood now that her music was not something to hide or minimize. It was part of her, and it deserved space. She did not know where that realization would lead or what choices it might require, but she felt ready to face them when the party finally began to wind down and the lights softened. Clara looked once more at the piano from across the room, and instead of longing, she felt gratitude. She had been seen not as an object of amusement, but as herself, and that knowledge stayed with her long after the final guest left. As the guests slowly began to leave, and the noise of the party faded, Clara helped clear the hall, moving chairs and collecting empty glasses. The mansion felt different now, quieter and almost reflective. The piano remained in its place untouched, and still she avoided looking at it too often, afraid the moment might feel less real. Once the night fully ended, her supervisor approached her and spoke in a low voice, saying she had handled the situation well, and that the host had noticed. Clara nodded and thanked her, unsure what that attention might mean. Later, the host asked to speak with her privately in a smaller sitting room away from the staff and remaining guests. Clara felt a familiar tension return, but she followed politely. The room was warm and softly lit, with shelves of books and framed photographs lining the walls. The host gestured for her to sit, and she did, though she kept her posture careful and respectful. He spoke in a measured tone, saying he had not expected what he heard, and that her performance surprised him more than he cared to admit. He asked why someone with her ability was working as a waitress. Clara explained that life had not offered many clear paths, that music did not always pay rent, and that responsibility had guided her choices more than dreams. She spoke without bitterness, simply stating facts. The host listened, tapping his fingers lightly, as if weighing something. He said talent like hers should not be wasted, and mentioned that he supported several cultural programs and events in the city. Clara felt cautious. She had learned that offers sometimes carried hidden expectations. She thanked him, but said she was careful about promises. She could not afford to misunderstand. Her honesty seemed to amuse him in a respectful way. He said he appreciated straightforward people, and asked if she would consider playing at a smaller private gathering in the future, not as a joke, but as a performer. The suggestion caught her off guard. She asked for time to think, and he agreed, giving her his assistant contact information before standing to signal the conversation was over. When she returned to the staff area, the other workers looked at her with curiosity. Some smiled, some asked quiet questions. She answered gently, not wanting to exaggerate anything. She changed out of her uniform and stepped outside into the cool night air. The city felt the same as always, busy and indifferent, but she felt changed within. She walked to the bus stop, replaying the evening in her mind, not with disbelief but with clarity. At home in her small room, she sat on the edge of her bed and let the silence settle. She thought about her mother, about the sacrifices made, and the music that had once filled their home. She realized that the embarrassment meant for her had turned into an opening, not because someone powerful allowed it, but because she had trusted herself when it mattered. She slept that night with a calm she had not known before, aware that the future was still uncertain, but no longer closed. Morning arrived quietly, and Clara woke with the memory of the piano still fresh in her mind. She lay still for a few moments, listening to the distant sounds of the city, and letting herself accept that the previous night had truly happened. There was no rush of excitement, only a steady awareness that something important had shifted. She prepared for work as usual, dressed simply, and ate a small breakfast, yet her thoughts kept returning to the conversation with the host and the unexpected offer he had made. At her next shift, the atmosphere felt different, though nothing had changed on the surface. Her supervisor greeted her warmly and assigned her duties without comment, but there was a new ease in the way people spoke to her. She worked carefully, focusing on each task, yet her confidence showed in small ways, in how she stood and how she moved. She noticed it herself and wondered when that change had begun. Perhaps it had always been there, waiting for permission to exist. During a quiet moment, she checked her phone and saw a message from an unknown number. It was the assistant of the host, following up politely and asking if Clara had considered the invitation. Her stomach tightened as she read it. This was no longer a distant possibility, but a real choice she could not ignore. She took a deep breath and replied that she would like to discuss details and understand expectations before agreeing. The response came quickly, respectful and clear, suggesting a meeting later that week. For the rest of the day, Clara felt a mixture of caution and resolve. She knew that accepting such an opportunity could bring growth, but also risk. She had seen how easily power could be used to control rather than support. She promised herself that she would not trade dignity for access, no matter how tempting the chance might appear. That promise gave her strength and clarity. That evening, she visited the community center, where an old piano stood slightly out of tune. It was the place she sometimes practiced when the room was free. She sat down and began to play, not to impress anyone, but to listen to herself. The music flowed naturally, steady and thoughtful. She realized how much she had grown without noticing, shaped by years of quiet discipline. Rather than applause, the sound filled the room and reminded her why she had started playing in the first place. As the days passed, Clara prepared for the meeting. She gathered her thoughts, wrote down questions, and set boundaries. She wanted to be treated as a musician, not a curiosity. When the day arrived, she dressed simply and arrived on time. The assistant welcomed her and led her to a modest office space. The host joined them shortly after and spoke without ceremony. He explained that he hosted a small cultural evening each month and wished to invite her to perform properly with respect and fair compensation. Clara listened carefully. She asked about payment, audience size, and creative freedom. Her voice was calm and clear. The host seemed slightly surprised by her professionalism, but answered honestly. He said he admired her confidence and agreed to her terms without negotiation. The conversation ended with a handshake and a clear agreement she would perform in 2 weeks and could choose her own pieces. Walking out of the building, Clara felt lightheaded, not from excitement, but from responsibility. This was no longer a moment, it was a step. She called her supervisor later that day and explained she would need 1 evening off in 2 weeks. The supervisor agreed and wished her well without asking questions. Clara sensed quiet pride in her voice. In the following days, Clara practiced with intention. She balanced work and preparation, carefully choosing music that reflected her voice rather than what she thought others wanted to hear. She rested when needed and trusted her instincts. She also spoke to a local music teacher who agreed to give her guidance and feedback. The support felt grounding and real. The night before the performance, Clara sat alone in her room and reflected on how easily the evening at the party could have gone differently. She understood now that the embarrassment had never truly been about her. It had been about power and expectation. What changed everything was not talent alone, but the courage to step forward honestly. She slept deeply, feeling prepared not just to play, but to be seen on her own terms. The evening of the performance arrived with a quiet sense of purpose. Clara finished her shift early and traveled across the city holding her music folder close to her chest. The venue was smaller than the mansion, but elegant in a simple way. Warm lights, soft chairs, and a small audience gathered with calm expectation. This time she was not wearing a uniform. She wore a modest dark dress that made her feel comfortable and steady. She was introduced by name, not by role, and that difference settled her nerves more than she expected. As she stepped toward the piano, she noticed familiar faces among the audience. A few musicians, a couple of guests from the party, and several people she did not recognize. All of them looked at her with interest, not curiosity, and she felt respected. Before playing a single note, the host sat quietly to the side, no longer the center of attention, and that shift felt right to her. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and rested her hands gently on the keys. She began with a piece that carried calm and restraint, letting the sound grow naturally. The piano was well-tuned and responsive, and the room held the music beautifully. Each note traveled clearly and returned to her, softened by the space. She felt grounded, present, and fully herself. The audience listened in silence, not the tense silence of expectation, but the open silence of attention. As the performance continued, Clara moved through different moods, allowing emotion without excess. She played with control, shaped by years of patience and quiet effort. Her breathing stayed steady and her thoughts remained focused on the sound and the feeling of connection. She sensed the audience leaning into the music, following the story she was telling without words. This time, she was not proving anything, she was simply sharing. Halfway through the set, she paused briefly and shifted to a piece her mother used to play. It was simple but deeply personal, and as she played it, she felt memory and gratitude rise within her. She kept her expression calm, but her touch carried warmth. The room felt closer, more human. A few listeners closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be fully present in the moment. When the final notes faded, the applause came naturally, not loud or dramatic, but sincere and full. Clara stood and acknowledged the audience with a gentle nod. Her heart felt full but steady. She returned to the piano for one final piece, choosing something hopeful and forward-looking. The ending felt complete, like a sentence that finally made sense without explanation. After the performance, several people approached her offering thanks and thoughtful comments. A music teacher spoke to her about potential study. A small event organizer asked if she would consider future performances. The host thanked her quietly and said he was glad he had listened instead of assuming. His voice carried respect without ownership, and Clara appreciated that. She felt no need to respond beyond a polite smile and honest gratitude. Later, as she walked home through the city streets, she felt tired but peaceful. The city lights reflected softly on the pavement, and the air carried a gentle coolness. She thought about how fear had once guided so many of her choices, and how slowly that fear was losing its hold. She understood now that confidence did not arrive suddenly. It grew through action, through saying yes when it mattered, and no when it was needed. In the weeks that followed, Clara continued working while accepting small performances that aligned with her values. She managed her time carefully, protecting her energy and her sense of self. She saved money and planned realistically, knowing that progress did not require haste. She stayed connected to her community center, offering to help younger students when she could and finding joy in shared learning. One afternoon, she returned to the center and sat at the old piano, the keys still uneven but familiar. She played for a small group of children who listened with wide eyes. She smiled at their questions and remembered herself at that age, curious, hopeful, and unaware of the limits others would try to place on her. She felt a quiet promise form inside her that she would help protect that sense of possibility when she could. Clara no longer measured her worth by who noticed her or where she was invited. She measured it by how honestly she lived and how faithfully she honored her craft. The memory of the party remained, But it no longer defined her, it was simply the moment when a door opened, because she chose to walk through it on her own terms. Life settled into a new rhythm for Clara, one that required balance, patience, and careful choices. She continued her regular work hours, but her evenings were now shaped by practice, small performances, and quiet planning. She did not rush to change everything at once, because she understood how fragile progress could be. She wanted each step to feel earned and stable rather than sudden and uncertain. This approach gave her a sense of control she had rarely felt before. Word of her performance spread slowly through genuine connections. Rather than noise, she was invited to play at modest gatherings, cultural evenings, and private lessons. None of them promised fame or wealth, but each offered respect and fair treatment. She accepted only those that felt right, turning down offers that seemed to focus more on novelty than music. Saying no was difficult at first, but it became easier as she learned to trust her instincts. One afternoon, Clara received a message from a small music school located not far from the community center. The director had heard her play and asked if she would consider teaching a few beginner classes each week. The idea surprised her. Teaching had never been part of her plan, yet the thought of guiding others felt meaningful. She visited the school, met the students, and felt an immediate sense of belonging. She agreed to try it for a short period to see how it felt. Teaching brought a different kind of fulfillment. The students were young and eager, their questions honest, and their progress slow, but sincere. Clara found herself explaining things she had once struggled to understand alone. And in doing so, she deepened her own knowledge. She saw parts of herself in the students, especially in those who doubted their ability before even trying. She encouraged them, gently reminding them that growth came from consistency rather than perfection. At the same time, she continued performing, choosing pieces that reflected her journey, music that carried quiet strength rather than dramatic display. Audiences responded to her authenticity, and she noticed that listeners often stayed after to talk not about technique, but about how the music made them feel. Those conversations mattered to her more than applause. They reminded her why she played in the first place. The host from the party contacted her once more to invite her to a larger event, this time a formal concert with a broader audience. Clara considered the offer carefully. She asked detailed questions and set clear conditions. When the host agreed, she accepted, knowing she was now able to advocate for herself without fear. The power dynamic had changed, not because of his status, but because of her clarity. As the date of the concert approached, Clara prepared steadily. She practiced daily, but also rested when needed. She learned to listen to her body and her emotions, understanding that burnout could undo progress. She spoke often with her music teacher and sought honest feedback. She welcomed critique without taking it as judgment. This mindset allowed her to grow without losing confidence. The concert itself was held in a respected hall, and though the audience was larger than any she had faced before, Clara felt calm. She stepped onto the stage with awareness of how far she had come, not measured by opportunity alone, but by self-respect. The performance flowed naturally, and the response was warm and sustained. She accepted the applause with gratitude, but did not let it define her. She knew who she was regardless of the room. After the concert, she received several messages from people interested in working with her, but she did not rush to reply. She took a day to sit quietly and reflect. She walked through the city, visited her favorite park, and thought about her mother. She wished she could share these moments with her, but she felt her presence in the music and in the choices she made with integrity. Clara realized that success did not mean leaving her past behind. It meant carrying it forward with honesty. The waitress uniform, the quiet nights of practice, the moment of attempted embarrassment, all of it had shaped her. But none of it limited her anymore. She was no longer waiting to be discovered or validated. She was building a life aligned with her values, and that realization brought a deep, steady peace. She understood now that her story was not about surprising others. It was about staying true to herself in rooms that once made her feel small. And in doing so, she had changed not only her own path, but the way others saw possibility. This understanding guided her as she looked ahead, not with urgency, but with confidence, ready for whatever the next chapter might bring. Time passed, and Clara no longer counted her days by shifts alone, but by balance. She woke each morning with a sense of direction, even when uncertainty remained. She continued teaching at the music school and found joy in watching her students gain confidence. Some were shy and hesitant, others restless and impatient, but each carried potential. She learned how to guide them with patience rather than pressure. And in doing so, she healed parts of herself that once felt overlooked. She realized that sharing music did not reduce its value, it multiplied it. Her performances became more consistent and intentional. She no longer accepted invitations that felt hollow or performative. She chose spaces where music mattered and where respect was mutual. This approach did not make her wealthy, but it made her steady. And she valued that more than recognition. She kept her small room for a while longer, saving carefully and planning realistically, knowing that security was built step by step rather than through sudden leaps. One afternoon, she returned to the mansion area for an unrelated event and passed the street where the party had once taken place. She paused briefly, not out of longing or resentment, but reflection. She remembered the weight of that moment and how exposed she had felt. She also remembered the strength that surfaced when she chose to trust herself. The memory no longer carried pain, It carried clarity. She smiled softly and continued walking. Clara eventually reduced her hours as a waitress, not because she felt above the work, but because her schedule demanded change. Her supervisor supported her decision and thanked her for her dedication over the years. That farewell felt respectful and complete. She kept in touch with some of the staff who had cheered for her quietly on that first night. She never forgot where she came from and never pretended otherwise. As her confidence grew, she began composing small pieces of her own, nothing ambitious, just honest expressions of emotion and experience. She played them for trusted listeners and accepted feedback with openness. The process felt vulnerable, but freeing. She was no longer only interpreting music, she was creating it, and that deepened her sense of purpose. One evening after a small recital, a young woman approached her and shared that watching Clara play reminded her that it was never too late to try again. The words stayed with Clara long after the conversation ended. She understood then that her journey mattered not because it was dramatic, but because it was real and relatable. She had not risen overnight, she had grown steadily, and that made her story accessible to others who needed reassurance more than inspiration. Clara thought often of her mother and felt grateful for the foundation she had been given even in difficult circumstances. She carried those lessons into every room she entered. She spoke kindly, but firmly. She listened more than she spoke, and she trusted her instincts without apology. These qualities shaped her path more than talent alone ever could. Years later, when asked about the moment that changed everything, she did not speak of humiliation or applause, she spoke of choice. She explained that the turning point came when she decided to honor herself even when others did not expect it. She believed that courage was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and consistent, built through everyday decisions to stay true rather than safe. Clara continued to live simply even as opportunities expanded. She found contentment in routine, in teaching and music, and in community. She never chased crowds, she focused on connection. She learned that fulfillment came not from proving others wrong, but from living honestly enough that proof was no longer required. Her life did not become a story of sudden fame or wealth, but it became a story of alignment and dignity. She carried her music forward with care and intention, and she allowed it to evolve as she did. The night she was compelled to play the piano remained part of her history, but it no longer defined her. It was simply the beginning of a chapter she wrote herself. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them.